The place where the air seems to have been forgotten. Imagine a place where the wind does not blow. It cuts through. It comes slicing across the plateau like an invisible blade, raising dust, shaking prayer flags, striking ancient rocks that seem to have been there since before human memory. The sky is metallic, immense, cold, so open that it gives the feeling that the earth has lost its ceiling, and at the same time has become too high for the rest of the world to reach. In front of you, distant mountains rise like silent walls. They do not seem to invite. They seem to watch. The horizon does not end. It moves farther away. And the more you look, the more you understand that there is a different kind of loneliness here. It is not the loneliness of an empty place. It is the loneliness of a place that is too vast. This is Tibet. But do not think of it only as a point on the map. Tibet does not present itself as an ordinary region. It appears as a frontier, a physical and spiritual edge of the planet, a place where the known world begins to lose its voice and where every step seems to ask the ground for permission. Here, breathing is already a form of effort. The air is thin, dry, almost scarce. It enters the lungs as if it were only half there. The body notices before the mind does. First comes the shortness of breath, then the slower step, then the heart beating with a strange urgency, even when you are not running. And then you understand the first law of this place. In Tibet, altitude is in command. It is not poetry. It is geography entering the blood. Here, nature does not make room. It demands adaptation. You do not cross the plateau the way you cross just any road. You slow down, measure your breathing, learn to watch the sky, learn that the cold can arrive without asking permission, that the wind can turn silence into a threat, and that a distant mountain may be farther away than your courage imagines. In Tibet, the human being seems small. Small before the slopes, small before the valleys, small before the ancient layers of the earth, compressed into stone, ice, and altitude. Everything here recalls a simple and uncomfortable truth. Civilization may draw borders, build roads, raise temples, but there are places where nature remains in command. And even so, this apparent emptiness hides a force that feeds the world. Beneath the snow, the ice, and the mountains, water begins its journey. First as frozen brightness, then as a trickle, then as a river, and farther on, as life for entire regions of Asia. What is born here does not stay here. It descends through gorges, crosses valleys, passes through borders, sustains peoples, crops, cities, and histories. Tibet seems isolated, but its waters travel much farther than any empire. That is why this place is so strange. It seems distant from everything, but it touches everything. It seems silent, but it carries the future roar of giant rivers. It seems frozen in time, but it holds movements that began millions of years ago. Here, ice is an archive. The mountain is a wall. The wind is a warning. And silence. Silence seems to have weight. But there is something even deeper on this plateau. At the heart of this immensity, there is a mountain that millions respect. Few approach without reverence, and no one treats as an ordinary mountain. Mount Kailash. It is not just a rise of rock and snow. For many, it is an axis. Mystery, presence. A point where geography stops being only landscape and begins to become faith. Because in Tibet, some landscapes are not conquered. They are circled in silence. The roof of the world is not a metaphor. When people say Tibet is the roof of the world, that may sound like a phrase that is too beautiful. almost touristy, almost ready to be printed on a postcard with snow-covered mountains and an impossible blue sky. But here, that expression is not decoration, it is a warning. You are in one of the highest and most difficult regions on the planet. An immense territory suspended over Asia, where plateaus stretch out like seas of stone, mountains close off the horizon like walls, valleys suddenly appear like deep cracks in the earth, and shining lakes emerge in the middle of nowhere, reflecting a sky so clear that it seems too close. Tibet does not seem high only because it is above sea level. It seems high because it is above the ordinary rhythm of humanity. Here, time moves differently. Distances deceive. A mountain that seems nearby may require hours on the road. A village in the valley may be separated from the next one by icy passes, dangerous curves, and miles of silence. The map may try to organize everything into lines, names, and borders, but when you look at the landscape, you understand that paper can never fully contain what exists here. The Tibetan Plateau is one of the Earth's great highland systems. It is not just a beautiful region in the center of Asia. It is a gigantic mass of altitude, ice, snow, rivers, winds, and mountains that influences far beyond its own territory. What happens here speaks to the climate, to the waters, to the ecosystems, and to the lives of millions of people who may never set foot in Tibet. This is one of the first contradictions the place reveals. Tibet seems isolated, but it is not. It seems far from everything, but its waters descend very far away. It seems silent, but its winds help shape climate patterns. It seems empty, but it holds springs, lakes, glaciers, and natural corridors that feed a huge part of Asia. What is born high up does not remain high up. The water escapes, descends, crosses through, carries with it the memory of the mountains. And that is where Tibet stops being just a setting. It becomes an origin of rivers, origin of routes, origin of myths, origin of questions that cannot fit into a simple answer. But make no mistake, the beauty here comes at a high price. The same crystal clear sky that enchants also exposes the lack of air. The same mountain that seems sacred can block the path. The same turquoise blue lake that hypnotizes can be surrounded by cold, wind, and isolation. A road may look cinematic from above, but on the ground, it becomes something else. Narrow curves, unstable slopes, cliffs, fog, sudden snow, and long stretches where help does not arrive quickly. Here, a small mistake can become a big one. A storm changes the landscape in minutes. The cold enters through your clothes as if it were searching for your bones. The wind does not make noise only in the flags. It strikes the doors, the roofs, the footsteps, the thoughts. In certain parts of the plateau, the silence does not calm. It watches. And even so, people live here. They plant where it is possible, raise animals where the altitude allows, walk around temples, follow ancient roads, protect traditions, adapt the body, the house, the food, the faith, and time itself to what geography permits. Because in Tibet, living has never been just occupying space. Living is negotiating with the impossible. That is why the monasteries seem so impressive when they appear on the slopes. They are not there by chance. They seem to grow out of the rock itself, as if faith had learned to use the mountain as a foundation. That is why the prayer flags make so much sense in this wind. They do not decorate the landscape. They speak with it. Each piece of colored fabric sways like a human attempt to leave a message in a territory where nature speaks louder. Tibet teaches an uncomfortable lesson. Civilization can build roads, temples, and cities, but there are places where nature remains the oldest government, and perhaps that is why everything here seems to have two layers. The first is visible: mountains, lakes, stones, villages, roads, herds, temples. The second is harder to explain: the feeling that every element of the landscape carries spiritual weight. Not because the place needs fantasy, but because Tibet's very scale pushes the human mind toward respect. When you stand before an immensity like this, it becomes difficult to believe that the earth is only ground. Here, altitude becomes destiny, water becomes power, solitude becomes language, and the wind, which at first seemed only cold, begins to sound like an ancient voice crossing the plateau. But to understand why Tibet seems so impossible, you need to go back long before the monasteries, before the caravans, before the kingdoms. You need to go back to the time when entire continents began to push against each other. Stage 3. The origin of the giant when the earth raised the ground. To understand Tibet, you need to forget for a moment the roads, the temples, the prayer flags, and the monasteries hanging from the mountains. Before all of that, there was pressure, slow pressure, brutal, silent. Long before any pilgrim walked across this plateau, long before any kingdom was born among the valleys, the earth itself began to move on a scale the human mind can barely imagine. Entire continents were on the move, not like boats sailing across an ocean, but like gigantic plates sliding over the planet's hot interior, pushed by deep, invisible, stubborn forces. To the south, the Indian plate was advancing north. Ahead of it was Eurasia. And when those colossal masses met, the earth did not break like glass. It crumpled, folded, wrinkled. It stacked ancient layers on top of one another, as if the planet had pressed its own skin until it created a wall. From that collision, one of the greatest geological spectacles on Earth was born. The Himalayas rose, and behind them, the Tibetan plateau began to rise like an immense platform suspended over Asia. It is almost impossible to look at Tibet without feeling that ancient violence. The mountains do not seem like just mountains. They seem like raised scars. The valleys do not seem like just passages. They seem like deep tears. The gorges do not seem like accidents. They seem like wounds opened by water after the stone was pushed toward the sky. Here, the ground has memory. Each slope carries geological time. Each rock wall holds ancient layers, compressed, folded, broken, and exposed by wind, ice, and rivers. When you walk through Tibet, you are not only stepping on land, you are stepping on millions of years compressed beneath your feet. And perhaps that is why everything here seems larger than it should. The silence seems older. The wind seems to have crossed through ages. The stone seems tired of existing, and the mountains, even motionless, give the feeling that they are still rising, still responding to that continental collision that began so long ago. In Tibet, the landscape was not carved with delicacy. It was forced into existence. The altitude was born from compression. The mountain ranges were born from the shove. The valleys were born from the resistance of rock and the insistence of water. The rivers found weak points and began to cut. The ice advanced, retreated, polished, and broke. The wind entered the cracks, carried dust, revealed shapes, erased others. And so, slowly, the earth created a place that seems less like an ordinary region and more like a frontier between worlds. But Tibet's geology did not remain trapped in the past. It shaped everything that came afterward. When you look at a Tibetan village, it is rarely where it is by chance. It appears where there is water, where the wind allows it, where the valley opens a pause, where a small field can receive barley, where animals can graze, where the cold does not win every day. The roads also obey the terrain. They do not follow the most beautiful path. They follow the possible path. They go around mountains, search for passes, descend through narrow valleys, follow rivers, and disappear behind curves that seem drawn by someone trying to convince nature to let them pass. In Tibet, the road is never fully its own master. It depends on the mountain. It depends on the snow. It depends on the slope not collapsing. It depends on the sky not closing in. That is why a journey here has something ritual-like about it. Even with engines, bridges, and asphalt, crossing the plateau still requires patience. You feel that you are not merely moving from place to place. You are being tested. The body reacts to the altitude. The eyes search for the next valley. The breath follows the rhythm of the curves. Time stops being a clock and becomes weather, distance, light, and breath. And Tibetan culture grew within this logic. Faith rises because the terrain forces everything to rise. Monasteries cling to the slopes as if they had sprouted from the rock. Temples appear in places where isolation seems impossible, but also necessary. Flags flutter on high passes not merely to decorate the landscape, but as if marking crossing points between the human world and something greater. Here, spirituality was not born separate from geography. It learned from it. When the mountain blocks the path, the human being learns to go around. When the valley closes in, they learn to wait. When the air runs short, they learn to walk slowly. When silence dominates, they learn to listen. Tibet transformed limits into culture, transformed altitude into identity, transformed distance into protection, and transformed the landscape into sacred language. Because in places like this, nature is not a backdrop. It teaches. It imposes rhythm. It decides where life can stay and where life must only pass through. In Tibet, the terrain does not remain still in the background of the image. It decides the path. It closes doors, opens corridors, hides valleys, protects kingdoms, and turns a simple journey into a kind of trial, where every curve seems like a prayer. In Tibet, a road is never just a road. It is a fragile line trying to cross a territory that was not made to make passage easy. It climbs as if searching for air. It bends as if trying not to wake the mountain. It disappears behind mist, reappears beside cliffs, crosses narrow bridges, follows icy rivers, and keeps going like someone who knows that turning back can also be difficult. Here, every curve seems to have been won with patience, and yet nothing seems truly conquered. For centuries, before asphalt, before trucks, before highways cutting across the plateau, Tibet's paths were made by feet, hooves, and memory. Caravans advanced slowly between valleys and mountain passes. Men, women, Tibetan horses, mules, and yaks carried tea, salt, wool, grains, fabrics, stories, and rumors of distant worlds. The ancient tea horse road was not just trade. It was resistance in motion. From the forests of Yunnan, tea traveled to the highlands. From the plateau, horses and Tibetan products descended toward other worlds. Each exchange carried more than goods. It carried culture, survival, power, and adaptation. But imagine that path. No modern tunnel, no gas station, no reliable signal, no safe forecast. Only the trail, the wind, the snow, the loose stone, the tired animals, and the need to keep going. The cold bit at the hands. The air grew thinner with every climb. The throat dried out. Steps sank into mud. ice or dust. And when the caravan stopped, the silence of the plateau did not seem like rest. It seemed like a question. Those who crossed these paths knew that Tibet did not forgive haste. Even today, even with modern roads, that feeling remains. Engineering has arrived. Concrete has arrived. Bridges have arrived. Tunnels tear through mountains. Vehicles cross passes once reserved for long journeys, and highways bring villages, cities, and borders closer together. But modernity in Tibet never arrives as the absolute ruler. It arrives negotiating. A road may be wide in one stretch and minutes later, narrow before an unstable slope. It may cross barley fields lit by the sun and then climb into a zone where the wind changes, the temperature drops, and the landscape becomes almost lunar. It may pass beside prayer flags fluttering fiercely, as if each piece of colored fabric were trying to protect those who continue onward. The flags do not seem like decorations, they seem like warnings. There, high on the passes, where the wind cuts through without meeting a barrier, they move like small voices before an immense nature. Blue, white, red, green, and yellow dance in the thin air, carrying prayers far away upward to where the eye cannot reach. And the road continues. It passes many stones engraved with mantras. It passes distant monasteries, clinging to the slopes like sentinels. It passes villages where houses seem to have learned to crouch against the wind. It passes rivers fed by glaciers, bridges over cold waters, gorges where the sound of the engine seems small before the roar of the valley. In certain stretches, the road becomes pure tension. A sequence of sharp curves climbs the mountain like a staircase drawn by someone with no fear of heights. On one side, the rock wall. On the other, the void. The mist comes in suddenly. The ground darkens. A truck appears coming from the opposite direction. For a few seconds, everything depends on calm, calculation, and trust. Here, the steering wheel is not just direction. It is silent prayer. And perhaps that is why Tibetan roads have something spiritual about them. Even when they are modern, they continue repeating the ancient gesture of pilgrimages, climbing, going around, accepting the rhythm of the mountain, breathing little, moving slowly. In Tibet, a road does not defeat the mountain. It negotiates with it. It negotiates with the snow that closes passages, with the rain that loosens stones, with the ice that hides danger, with the altitude that tires the driver before the trip is over, with the distance that turns any mistake into waiting, with the silence that follows every mile as if it were sitting in the back seat. And still, these roads exist because life needs to circulate. Along them pass food, pilgrims, workers, monks, families, merchants, tourists, soldiers, dreams, and farewells. Ancient stories pass along them too, repeated for generations, of caravans that disappeared in the storm, of travelers saved by monasteries, of animals that found the way when humans could no longer see anything. In Tibet, a road is memory. It is risk. It is connection. It is proof that human beings insist on crossing even the places that seem to say no. But there is one detail that changes everything. Many of these roads follow the same paths that water found first. They follow valleys, go around gorges, cross rivers, and search for the openings that nature carved long before any bridge. Because before human beings opened a passage, the rivers were already cutting through the plateau. At first glance, Tibet seems too distant to matter. An immense plateau, cold, dry, silent. A place where the wind crosses the landscape as if it were alone in the world. To those who look from far away, it may seem like only an isolated region. made of mountains, high lakes, difficult roads, and horizons that never end. But that is one of Tibet's greatest illusions, because what happens here does not stay here. High in these mountains, deep inside these snows, in the glaciers that shine beneath a harsh, almost white sun, one of Asia's most important stories begins. The story of water. Water begins as silence, a brightness trapped in ice, a thread running beneath the snow, an almost invisible crack in the mountain. Then it becomes a stream, a river, a gorge, a border, food, conflict, life. And little by little, what seemed like only still ice turns into movement. Tibet and the surrounding mountains are often called the third pole, not because they are near the Arctic or Antarctica, but because this region holds one of the largest concentrations of ice outside the polar zones. It is as if the Earth had placed a suspended reserve of water here, locked in altitude, waiting for time, the sun, the seasons, and gravity to do their work. That is also why this region is called Asia's water tower. And the image is perfect. A tower does not need to move to supply distant places. It stays high up. The water comes down, and everything below it depends on that flow. In Tibet, that logic appears on a continental scale. Water is born high up and then travels through valleys, gorges, plains, borders, and civilizations. It changes name, changes speed, changes color, but it continues carrying something from the place where it began. The cold of the mountains, the dust of the rocks, the memory of the ice. The Yarlung Changpo is one of these giant arteries. It runs through Tibet as if it were searching for a way out of the high world. It begins in elevated regions, crosses the plateau, moves between mountains, gains strength, goes around immense obstacles, and farther ahead, as it continues south and east, becomes part of the story of the Brahmaputra. The same flow that begins among ice, stone, and silence eventually reaches fertile lands, dense populations, fields, villages, and cities that live at another rhythm, in another climate, at another altitude. It is almost hard to believe that everything is connected, but it is. The water that begins high up does not know the borders that maps draw. It descends because gravity commands it. It crosses through because the terrain allows it. It feeds because life depends on it. And along the way, it connects worlds that seem completely separate. The same great system of mountains, plateaus, glaciers, and springs is connected to rivers that have shaped the history of Asia. The Indus flows toward regions that depend deeply on its water. The Mekong crosses entire landscapes and countries. The Yangtze and the Yellow River carry immense importance for China. The Ganges is more than a river. It is life, spirituality, and civilization for millions. The Salween runs through difficult mountains and valleys, still preserving a sense of wildness in many stretches. And all of this helps explain why Tibet cannot be seen only as a remote place. It is remote to reach, but central to understand. Here, snow is not just a beautiful landscape. A glacier is not just scenery for a photograph. A blue lake high on the plateau is not just a mirror of the sky. Everything is part of a larger system, sensitive, ancient, and vital. The water that flows beneath the ice can, many miles later, irrigate fields. It can move turbines. It can supply cities. It can sustain animals. It can define routes. It can bring peoples closer together. It can also create disputes, because where there is dependence, there is tension. And Tibet stands above many dependencies. But it is important to understand this without turning the landscape into panic. Tibet is not an ice time bomb. nor a frozen myth waiting to end. It is a living, complex system where climate, altitude, monsoon, snow, glaciers, rivers, and ecosystems are constantly interacting. Changes in this balance do not affect only distant mountains. They affect crops, energy, water supply, animals, forests, deltas, cities, and the way millions of people organize their own lives. Nature here works in silence, but its consequences speak far away. A winter with less snow can be felt far below. A different kind of thaw can alter the rhythm of a river. A stronger monsoon can turn slopes into danger. A prolonged drought can change harvests. In Tibet, the high and the low are connected by threads of water, and perhaps that is what makes this place so powerful. It seems motionless, but it is always sending something out from itself. Water, cold, wind, sediment, history. The glacier melts a little, the stream is born. The stream meets another. The current gains body, the mountain narrows the path, the river accelerates, the stone resists, the water insists. And over time, what was only a shining thread begins to cut through the earth. In Tibet, water is not weak. It is patient. It does not need to win all at once. It works for centuries, for millennia. It digs, pushes, drags, knocks down, feeds. Where the mountain seems absolute, water finds a crack. Where the plateau seems eternal, water draws an exit. Where silence seems to dominate, water prepares a roar. And that roar grows stronger when the Yarlung Tsongpo advances. Because there is a moment when the river stops seeming like only a river and begins to seem like geological force in motion. It does not cross the landscape gently. It challenges it. It meets giant walls, violent curves, absurd drops, and keeps cutting. There, Tibet reveals another face. Not the quiet face of the high lakes, not the suspended face of the snows, but the brutal face of water opening a path where the stones seem to say no. But there is a river in Tibet that does not merely cross the landscape. It tears through the earth in such a brutal way that it seems to reveal the skeleton of the planet. And then, when you think you have already understood Tibet, it changes. The plateau that seemed made only of wind, stone, ice, and silence begins to open into another landscape. The air remains high. The mountain remains immense. But something happens in the valleys. The color changes. Moisture appears. Green begins to overcome the aridity, as if a secret part of Tibet had stayed hidden behind the walls of snow. Here, the dry world meets the wet world. In the Nyingchi region in southeastern Tibet, the landscape seems to challenge the classic image many people have of Tibet. Instead of only cold plains and empty horizons, forests appear, slopes covered with vegetation, deep valleys, mist rising among trees, and snow-covered peaks watching everything from a distance. It is almost as if Tibet opened a side door. A door to another planet within the same planet. The reason lies in the meeting of altitude, mountains, and monsoons. Moisture coming from the south meets gigantic barriers. The terrain forces the air to rise. Clouds gather. Rain appears. And where you once expected only stone and cold, forests, living rivers, wet ravines, and surprising biodiversity emerge. Here, nature does not change language, it changes voice. The silence of the plateau gives way to the sound of water, a distant roar, a flow hidden deep in the valley, an echo between green walls. The wind still exists, but now it passes through leaves, wet slopes, and fog. The light no longer strikes only bare stone. It spreads in layers, crosses through vapor, touches snow, finds moss, shines on the river. And at the center of this transformation is the Yarlung Tsongpo, The same river that begins high up among ice and vastness continues its journey until it finds one of the most impressive passages on Earth, the Yarlung Tsangpo Grand Canyon. It is often described as the deepest land canyon in the world, with stretches that exceed 20,000 feet in depth. But numbers by themselves do not explain what that means. Imagine a colossal crack opened in the body of the mountain, a place where the river does not only run but disappears. It enters violent curves, vanishes between giant walls, returns as a roar, carves the rock, raises mist, swallows light, and turns the valley into a kind of living throat. Down below, the water seems small, but it is the one that is winning. Stone has size, water has time, and in Tibet, time is a force that does not need to shout. The Yarlung Tsangpo bends, insists, presses, drags sediments, cuts through mountains, and opens a path so deep that it seems to reveal the skeleton of the planet. From above, the landscape causes vertigo. The eye tries to follow the river but gets lost. One slope falls, another rises. A snow-covered peak appears above an almost subtropical valley. Cold and green exist in the same frame, as if two geographies had been forcefully stitched together. That is what makes this part of Tibet so unexpected. Here, you see flowers before the snow, forests below sacred mountains, moisture inside a territory known for aridity, roaring where before there was silence. Tibet is not a single landscape, it is a collision of worlds. It is altitude and forest, ice and monsoon, ancient rock and lush life, deep valley and open sky, a place where nature seems to test every possible combination, as if saying, "Did you think I was simple?" And perhaps that is one of Tibet's greatest secrets. It never reveals itself completely all at once. First, it shows the thin air, then the endless plateau, then the impossible roads, then the water hidden in the ice. And now, suddenly, it shows an almost improbable green, as if the territory itself wanted to confuse anyone who tried to reduce it to a single image. In Nyingchi, Tibet breathes in another way. The valley seems softer, but no less powerful. The beauty is more humid, more colorful, almost delicate. But all it takes is one look at the canyon walls to remember, delicacy here is only appearance. The force is still there, in the unstable slopes, in the deep rivers, in the rains that come down without asking permission, in the mountains that compress the sky. Here, nature does not make room, it only changes form. And while the Yarlung Tsangpo continues cutting through the earth, carrying water, sediment, and memory far away, Tibet prepares another transformation. Because the green does not last forever. But the farther west you go, the more it disappears. And Tibet begins to show a harder face, an ocean of stone, wind, and ruins. The farther west you go, the more Tibet seems to lose the last concessions it still made to the human body. The green disappears. The forests are left behind. The moisture withdraws as if it had never existed. And before your eyes, a drier, more open, harsher territory appears. A world of high plains, salt lakes, bare mountains, and horizons that seem to run away every time you try to reach them. This is Western Tibet. The region of Ali, also called Ngari, seems like the roof of the world. A place so high, so remote, and so exposed that the very idea of distance begins to change. Here, it is not enough to say that something is far away. Everything seems far away. The next valley, the next road, the next house, the next sign of life. The wind blows without finding obstacles. It crosses the open space with the dry, constant, almost aggressive sound. Sometimes it seems like a whistle. Sometimes a low roar, sometimes only an invisible pressure pushing dust against the face, against the stones, against the remains of ancient worlds. During the day, the sun can burn with a harsh, white, merciless light. At night, the temperature plunges as if the sky had opened for the cold to enter all at once. The body finds no comfort. The skin feels the dryness. The breath remains short. The eyes search for a reference point, but the territory answers with emptiness. But that emptiness is deceptive, because Western Tibet is not only a high-altitude desert, it is an archive written in stone, clay, salt, wind, and ruin. In some places, erosion has transformed the land into sculptures so strange that they seem to have been built by a vanished civilization. Natural towers, jagged walls, pinnacles, corridors of hardened clay, shapes that resemble walls, temples, fortresses, and palaces swallowed by time. In the Zonda region, the so-called Jada Earth Forest seems like a ghost city made by geology itself. There are no windows, there are no doors, there are no voices, but the shape deceives the eye. You look at those eroded towers and almost expect to see someone walking among them. It is as if the earth had dreamed of a metropolis and then awakened alone. There, the wind does the work of thousands of years. It removes, wears down, reveals, erases. The rare rain cuts grooves. The light of late afternoon turns the formations into shadows of palaces. And for a few moments, you do not know whether you are standing before a natural landscape or the remains of a kingdom petrified by the gods. In Tibet, even erosion seems to have memory. And that feeling becomes even stronger when the ruins of Guj appear. The ancient kingdom of Guj does not appear like an ordinary city abandoned by time. It emerges from the landscape like a question. Temples, caves, walls, corridors, remains of palaces, and buildings clinging to the dry slopes tell the story of an ancient Tibet, connected by trade routes, religious ideas, artists, travelers, and influences coming from different directions across Asia. Guj was a political center. It was a religious center. It was a passageway for cultures. It was power high in the emptiness. Its paintings, temples, and traces reveal a world that was not as isolated as it seems. Western Tibet, despite the aridity and the distance, was once a bridge. Through here passed goods, monks, emissaries, knowledge, artistic styles, and beliefs that blended in silence, far from the great centers that usually dominate history books. But then came the decline. Conflicts, disputes, invasions, changes in power, abandonment, and what was once a kingdom became a ruin. Today, when you look at Guj, you do not see only broken walls. You see the fragility of any civilization before time, geography, and human ambition itself. The wind enters where there were once doors. Dust covers where there were once footsteps. Silence occupies where there were once chants, orders, negotiations, and prayers. And the question grows. When you look at these ruins, the question is not only who built this. The question is, what kind of world has to disappear for an entire city to turn to dust? That is the force of Western Tibet. It does not deliver mystery through tricks. It delivers mystery through absence. Through empty walls, through long roads, through dark caves, through distant mountains, through wild horses raising dust on the plains, as if they still carried the freedom of a time before borders. Here, everything seems to have survived out of stubbornness. The animals, the ruins, the roads, the salt lakes, the small human communities that endure where ordinary logic would say to leave. And in this territory of total exposure, you understand that Tibet is not only a landscape of spiritual beauty, it is also a place of loss, of disappearance, of worlds buried by their own immensity. The far west softens nothing. It removes the excess, removes the color, removes the shelter, removes the illusion of control, and leaves only the essential: stone, wind, altitude, memory, and silence. But no ruin, no hidden valley, and no lost road weighs as heavily in Tibet's imagination as the mountain that appears farther ahead. A mountain that is not treated as a destination to be conquered, but as a center of reverence. And then after crossing wind, ruins, high plains, and roads that seem to test the patience of the body, Tibet reveals its most unsettling symbol: a mountain. But not an ordinary mountain. Mount Kailash rises in western Tibet as an almost perfect form, isolated, firm, silent. Its faces seem drawn with a precision that unsettles. The snow marks its lines, the dark rock gives weight to its presence, and the sky around it seems too large, as if it were making room only so that it could be seen from far away. Here, the landscape changes tone. The wind keeps cutting. The air remains thin. The altitude continues to charge its price. But before Kailash, everything seems to slow down, even thought. Because there are mountains that human beings look at and want to climb, measure, defeat, photograph from the summit, turn into conquest. Kailash does not belong to that category. Everest is the mountain the world tried to conquer. Kailash is the mountain the world learned to circle, and that difference changes everything. For several spiritual traditions, such as Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, and the Bon tradition, Kailash is not just elevated rock, it is center, it is axis, it is sacred presence. It is a point where the physical world and the spiritual world seem to touch in silence. The mountain does not need to speak. It commands respect simply by being there. And perhaps that is the true mystery of Kailash. It is not a mystery of exaggerated legend, nor of some secret invented to frighten travelers. It is a deeper mystery, more human, harder to explain. Why do certain landscapes make millions of people lower their voices? Why can a mountain become more than stone? Why do some places not awaken a desire for possession, but reverence? In Tibet, this question is not answered with theory. It is answered with steps. Around Kailash, the Kora takes place, the circular pilgrimage. It is not just any walk. It is a movement of faith drawn on the ground. Pilgrims circle the mountain on a journey that demands body, breath, patience, and devotion. Each step faces the altitude. Each climb weighs on the lungs. Each descent punishes the knees. The wind hits the face. The dust gets into the clothes. The cold stiffens the hands. And still, people continue. Some walk in silence. Others spin prayer wheels. Others murmur mantras. Others prostrate themselves on the ground, get up, take a few steps, and prostrate themselves again, as if the entire body became a sentence of devotion written in the dust. Here, faith does not remain still inside a temple. It walks. It breathes little. It feels pain. It continues. The Kora transforms the mountain into a path, and transforms the path into a mirror. Because when circling Kailash, the pilgrim is not merely moving around a geographical formation. They are moving around a very ancient idea, that there are centers in the world that should not be possessed, only recognized. In Tibet, some landscapes are not conquered. They are circled in silence, and that silence is not empty. It is filled with wind, bells, footsteps, breathing, fluttering flags, stones marked by prayers, tired eyes, and a hope that is difficult to translate. The sound here is minimal, but the meaning is immense. A distant crack of ice, a piece of fabric striking the air, a boot scraping the earth, a mantra repeated so softly that it seems to blend with the mountain itself. Here, geography becomes faith, and faith becomes movement measured in steps, breathing, and endurance. Nearby, Lake Manasarovar expands the mystery. After the harshness of the path, the water appears like a mirror placed high on the world. The lake reflects the sky with an almost impossible calm. At certain moments, it seems as if the mountain duplicates itself on the surface, as if the world above and the world below were trying to recognize each other. The sacred water of Manasarovar does not have the violence of the rivers that tear through gorges. It has another power, the power of stillness. The lake seems to hold light. It holds clouds. It holds the deep blue of the Tibetan sky. It holds the image of the mountains around it, and before it, the visitor feels a strange reversal. After so much altitude, so much stone, and so much wind, it is the still water that seems closest to infinity. Kailash rises, Manasarovar reflects, one points upward. The other returns the sky to the earth. Together, they form a landscape where nature and spirituality do not separate. The mountain is not just a mountain. The lake is not just a lake. The walk is not just movement from one place to another. Everything becomes gesture. Everything becomes symbol. Everything becomes a way of reminding the human being that there are places where the world was not made to obey haste. And perhaps that is why Kailash remains so powerful, because it denies a very common modern idea that everything needs to be accessed, used, defeated, recorded, dominated. Kailash does not ask for applause. It does not ask for conquest. It does not need a summit reached in order to matter. It remains there motionless while generations pass around it. Pilgrims arrive tired. Travelers fall silent. The wind crosses the stones. The snow changes shape. The lake reflects another dawn. And the mountain continues to seem less like a destination and more like a question. What exists in a place that does not want to be conquered? Perhaps exactly this exists there. A limit. The limit of the body before altitude. The limit of ambition before the sacred. The limit of explanation before experience. In the heart of Tibet, Kailash teaches without saying a word. It teaches that there are landscapes that do not diminish when you approach them. They grow. They expand inside the mind. They make the human being remember that they are small, temporary, fragile, but also capable of walking through faith, through memory, through promise, through hope. And when the pilgrim continues around the mountain, with their chest tightened by the thin air and their feet marked by the road, they become part of something greater than a journey. They enter the ancient rhythm of the plateau. One step, one breath, one prayer, another step. And Tibet once again reveals its deepest truth. Here, nature does not make room. It demands respect, but Tibet does not live only on sacred mountains. Between the extremes of the plateau, there is a silent life that endures where almost nothing seems possible. After Kailash, after Manasarovar, after the mountain that is not conquered, and the lake that seems to reflect another world, Tibet asks another simple question. How does life continue here? Because from far away, the plateau may seem empty. An immensity of stone, wind, cold, and sky. A place where distance swallows everything, where the horizon never seems to arrive, where silence makes any human movement seem too small. But Tibet is not empty. It simply does not offer itself easily. Here, life exists at another rhythm, slower, more attentive, more dependent on the signs of the sky, the snow, the pasture, and the animals. To survive in this high world, it is not enough to occupy the landscape. You must know how to listen to it. Across the vast areas of the plateau, nomadic and semi-nomadic communities follow ancient routes, adapted to the seasons, the herds, and the changes in climate. The tents rise against the wind like small, dark fortresses. Smoke rises slowly. The animals gather. The cold prowls. And each everyday gesture carries an intelligence inherited from generations. Nothing here is excess. Everything must have a function. The clothing protects, the tent shelters, the fire gathers, the animal sustains, the food warms, the root matters, time decides. And at the center of this survival is the yak. The yak is not just an animal of Tibet. It is one of the great keys to life at altitude. Strong, hairy, resilient, adapted to the cold and the thin air, it accompanies human beings where other animals would struggle. Its milk becomes butter. Its wool becomes fabric. Its strength helps with transport. Its presence warms the economy, the home, the table, and the culture. In Tibet, the yak is food, work, shelter, and identity. It appears on the slopes, in the high fields, on the trails, near the tents, in the popular imagination, and in the most ordinary routine. Where there is a yak, there is possibility. There is churned milk. There is butter in the tea. There is wool against the cold. There is cargo crossing distances. There is a bridge between the human body and an environment that always seems willing to test limits. But it is not only the yak that reads this territory. The shepherds observe everything: the sky, the direction of the wind, the behavior of the herd, the texture of the snow, the color of the pasture, the distant sound of a bird, the change of light in the late afternoon. Where the visitor sees emptiness, the Tibetan reads signs: the wind changing, snow coming, the pasture worn out, an animal restless, weak ice, a heavy sky. This reading does not come from a book. It comes from repetition, from necessity, from mistakes that cost dearly, from the memory of parents and grandparents, from living with a place where nature does not accept distraction for very long. In agricultural areas, when the altitude allows, barley becomes another symbol of resistance. Few crops can withstand the conditions of the plateau, but barley finds its place. From it comes tsampa, roasted flour that runs through Tibetan history as a simple, practical food deeply tied to local identity. Tsampa is not luxury food. It is food of permanence. It is the kind of food that accompanies the traveler, the farmer, the monk, the shepherd. Mixed with yak butter tea, it carries warmth, energy, and memory. In a place where planting is already winning a silent battle against the cold, every grain has weight. And around this human life, there is another life, more discreet, more wild, almost invisible. In the high fields and plains, Tibetan antelopes move like delicate signs that the plateau breathes. Birds of prey cut across the sky, watching from above with an ancient calm. Golden eagles seem like owners of the air, circling over valleys and slopes, like messengers from a world where the sky is still in command. And somewhere in the mountains, almost always beyond the reach of the eyes, is the snow leopard. It does not appear as a spectacle. It appears as a possibility, a shadow among stones, a movement that may have been only wind, tracks in the snow, a gaze impossible to find twice. The snow leopard is the spirit of the slopes, not because it is a legend, but because it represents life that exists without announcing itself. It survives where the terrain is steep, cold, unstable and silent. It hunts among rocks, crosses ridges, disappears into slopes that seem empty. And by doing so, it reminds us that Tibet holds presences that do not need to be seen in order to be real. Here, even the invisible has weight. Tibetan mastiffs, on the other hand, are a concrete presence. Strong, watchful guardians, raised to protect herds and camps in a world where danger can come from the night, from wolves, from distance, or simply from exposure. They are part of the pact between humans and animals. Each one offers something so that everyone can get through one more winter. In Tibet, survival has never been a solitary act. It is a network. Human, animal, pasture, wind, water, fire, tent, mountain. Everything depends on everything. And when you understand this, the plateau stops seeming empty. It reveals itself as a system of resistance, a place where life does not spread easily. But when it appears with force. Less abundant, perhaps, but more aware of itself, more connected to the ground, more humble before the sky. Tibet does not shout life, it whispers, and only those who slow their pace can hear it. Among tents, herds, barley fields, and slopes where invisible predators walk, the plateau shows that its greatness is not only in its sacred mountains. It is also in the routine of those who wake up early, face the cold, milk the yak, prepare tea, watch the sky, and continue. Because here, resisting is also a form of faith. And then, after so much wind, so much road, and so much silence, Tibet finally reveals its most visible heart. The cities, the temples, and the pilgrimage paths where faith leaves marks on the ground. And then, after so much wind, so much road, and so much silence, Tibet begins to change sound. The emptiness of the plateau gives way to footsteps. The dust of the trails mixes with the movement of the streets. The immense horizon gives way to walls, rooftops, markets, voices, incense, and eyes that carry centuries of devotion. You arrive in Lhasa, the city that seems to hold the visible heart of Tibet. After crossing empty plateaus, you understand that Tibet is not only a sacred landscape, it is a civilization that learned to organize life around the invisible. Here, faith does not stay hidden in distant mountains. It circulates. It passes through the worn hands of pilgrims, spins in prayer wheels, rises in the smoke of incense, slides over lips in mantras repeated almost in a whisper, crosses markets, alleys, courtyards, temples, and faces. In Lhasa, the sacred is not separate from the city. It walks within it. On the Barkor circuit, the movement seems too ancient to belong only to the present. People walk in the same direction, circling the spiritual center of the city as if each lap were a way of aligning the body with something greater. There are slow steps, steady steps, tired steps. There are hands holding prayer beads. There are foreheads touching the ground. There are eyes that are not looking for spectacle but meaning. The Barkor is not just a street, it is an orbit, and at the center of that orbit is the Jokong. For many Tibetans, the Jokong is one of the most sacred places in the world. It does not impress through height like the Himalayas, nor through vastness like the plateau, but through spiritual density. It is as if centuries of prayers had accumulated there, layer by layer, until they transformed stone, wood, and gold into living memory. Outside, the city continues. Vendors talk, people pass by. The smell of butter, smoke, and dust mixes in the air. But near the temple, everything seems to gain another weight. Prayer does not interrupt the routine. It is part of the routine. In Lhasa, faith and urban life do not compete. They cross paths all the time. And then, above the city, the Potala appears. It dominates the horizon like a fortress of faith and power. Raised on the hill, with its white and red walls, the Potala Palace seems to watch Lhasa from another time. It is not just a grand building, it is a symbol, a place where spirituality, authority, history, and identity met for centuries. From far away, it seems almost unreal, as if it had been placed between the sky and the city to remind us that in Tibet, power also learned to speak the language of the mountains. The Potala does not blend into the landscape, it commands it. But Lhasa is not made only of monuments, it is made of circulation, of people, of contrasts, of tourists taking pictures and pilgrims who are not there to be seen, of modern stores near ancient practices, of cell phones in hands and mantras on lips, of avenues, policing, commerce, administration, memory, and faith occupying the same space. And it is here that Tibet reveals its most delicate complexity. Because this is not only a region of spiritual beauty, it is also a territory where history, identity, religion, borders, modern administration, and geopolitics overlap. Different layers occupy the same ground. Historical Tibet, cultural Tibet, religious Tibet, and Tibet, administered by the Chinese state, coexist within a reality that cannot fit into one simple sentence. And perhaps that is precisely why Lhasa is so powerful. It does not allow an easy reading. You can look at the Potala and see architecture. You can look again and see faith. You can look once more and see power, memory, absence, resistance, change, and permanence. You can walk through the Barkor and see only movement, but if you pay attention, you realize that those repeated circles say something about continuity, about a culture that learned to move in circles without necessarily standing still, about a devotion that does not need to shout in order to exist. Lhasa is this. A city where the invisible has an address, where the mountain meets the street, where prayer brushes against commerce, where the past does not disappear, but also does not remain untouched. After so many miles of isolation, Lhasa shows that Tibet does not live only in the silence of the heights. It also lives in the friction of the city, in the pilgrim's step, in the palace's shadow, in the smoke before the temple, in the face of someone turning a prayer wheel, as if keeping the world in motion. And when you observe all of this, you understand that Tibet cannot be reduced to a beautiful landscape, to a political issue, to a religious mystery, or to a remote destination. It is all of that at the same time, and something else that escapes. In the end, Tibet does not answer everything. It does something rarer. It changes the question. And now, when the wind crosses the plateau again, it no longer seems like only wind. The sky remains metallic. The mountains remain motionless. The air remains thin, short, demanding. Breathing still asks for calm. The silence still has weight. But after everything you have seen, that silence no longer seems empty. It contains ice. It contains rivers being born in secret. It contains roads that rise like prayers. It contains monasteries attached to rock. It contains ruins of kingdoms that the wind transformed into memory. It contains pilgrims walking around a mountain that is not conquered. It contains sacred lakes reflecting the sky. It contains yaks, nomads, barley fields, invisible leopards, fluttering flags, prayer wheels, tired steps, and millions of years of earth in motion. In Tibet, you realize that the human being is not at the center of everything. Sometimes they are only a small figure crossing a landscape too ancient to care about haste. And perhaps that is the great lesson of this place. Tibet does not try to convince you easily. It does not deliver quick answers. It does not explain itself completely. It simply remains high, cold, immense, sacred, harsh, beautiful in a way that almost frightens. Here, nature does not make room. It teaches limits. It teaches patience. It teaches respect. And when you look at this plateau one last time, you understand that some landscapes were not made to fit inside our will. They exist to remind us that the world is larger, older, and more powerful than any map can show. This place seems like another planet hidden in plain sight. Here, nature is still in command, and what happens here does not stay here. It descends through rivers, crosses borders, feeds peoples, and reminds the world that some landscapes were not made to be dominated. They were made to be respected. And now tell me, would you have the courage to cross Tibet? Or is this one of those places we only understand when we accept staying silent?